All right. Hello, everyone. We're going to kick things off with part two. The problem I had was, how do I map a business? Unlike a board game such as chess, with its turn-based moves, when you consider a business, it is a living thing. It consists of a network of people, a mass of different activities, and reserves of capital, including financial, physical, human, and social. It consumes, it produces, it grows, and it dies. Like all organisms, any business exists within a community of others, an ecosystem. It competes and cooperates for resources, and it's shaped by and shapes its environment. Even within a business, people come and go. The things we do, the things we build, and the things that others desire change over time. All firms are in a constant state of flux, and the ecosystem it lives within never stands still. What sort of map can cope with that? I struggled with these concepts for many months, playing around with different ideas of mapping and how to represent this maelstrom. I knew any map had to have those basic elements of being visual, context-specific, the position of components relative to an anchor, and some means of describing movement, but I had no idea where to start. It was at this point I thought about mapping what was core for my business and questioning how this changed using some form of mind map. My reasoning was simple. A business, like all organisms, needs to continuously adapt to changes in order to survive. And if we could somehow describe this, then maybe that would give us a map. Take, for example, the multinational Finnish company Nokia. Originally founded in 1865 as a paper mill, the company has undergone many transformations through various close calls with bankruptcy. From a paper mill to a rubber manufacturer to consumer electronics to a telecommunications giant, this organism has radically evolved. The problem for me was the core for Nokia today was not its core in 1865, but instead an unimaginable flight of fancy at the time. How could I connect the two? When you focus on what is core for a company, then the question becomes whether you mean core today, core yesterday, or core tomorrow. They are not necessarily the same. I followed this logic down endless rabbit holes, getting nowhere fast. In frustration, I started to ask, why do things change? The responses I was given when talking to my peers varied from progress to innovation to disruption. Examples across history were normally cited, including the appearance of random innovations that impact the way we operate, from the telephone to electricity to computing. But given the upheaval they cause, close calls with bankruptcy, the death of former great companies, and the need to continuously learn new skills, then why would anyone want this? Surely a more sedate, slower rate of change would be more comfortable. So why are things changing? Alas, it seems that we don't get a choice. In any industrial ecosystem, novel and new things constantly appear as a consequence of the desire for companies and individuals to gain an advantage over others. Those things that are useful will be copied. They will spread until the once novel and new becomes commonplace. Yesterday's wonders are destined to become today's discounted special offers. The magic of the first electric light bulb, the first computer, and the first telephone are now an expected norm. We no longer marvel at such things, but instead we would reel in utter shock if presented with a workplace that did not provide them. Competition and the desire to gain an advantage not only creates change, it spreads it and forces companies to adopt it. Somehow, I had to map this competition itself, including the journey from novel to commonplace. But what is that journey, and what are the components that I'm going to map? The more I looked into this, the more complex it became, because that journey from novel to commonplace is not the end of the story. These extremes are connected as one enables the other. A historical demonstration of this would be Maudsley's screw-cutting lathe in 1800. The invention of the first screw thread is often cited as 400 BC by Archytas of Tarentum, 428 BC to 350 BC. Early versions of this, and the subsequent nut and bolt designs, were custom made by skilled artisans, with each nut fitting one bolt and no other. The introduction of Maudsley's lathe enabled repeated production of uniform nuts and bolts with standard threads. One nut now fitted many bolts. The artisan's skill of building the perfect nut and bolt was replaced by more mass-produced and interchangeable components. The novel had become commonplace. Whilst those artisans might have lamented the loss of their industry, those humble components also enabled the rapid creation of more complex machinery. Uniform mechanical components enabled the faster building of ships, guns, and other devices. It also allowed for the introduction of manufacturing systems that took advantage of these components. In 1803, collaboration between Marc Isambard Brunel and Maudsley led to the principles of modern mass production being introduced at Portsmouth Dockyard. The use of block-making machinery replaced the craft of custom-made pulley blocks, an essential component in the rigging of naval ships. A total of 45 machines enabled a magnitude of order increase in productivity with highly standardized outputs. This system of manufacture helped change shipmaking itself. The practices subsequently spread through industries, leading to what became known as the armory method, and later the American system of manufacturing. Things not only evolved from novel to commonplace, enabling new things to appear, but they also allowed for new forms of practice and organization. Throughout our history, it has always been standardization of components that has enabled creations of greater complexity. We are always standing on the shoulders of past giants, of past innovations, of past wonders that have become commonplace units. Without such well-defined mechanical or electrical components, then our world would be a less technologically rich place. No internet, no generators, no TV, no computers, no light bulbs, and no toasters. Why toasters? In 2009, the designer Thomas Thwaites exhibited his attempt to build a common household toaster from scratch at the Royal College of Arts. Beginning with mining the raw materials, he aimed to create a product that is usually built with common components and sold for a few pounds in the local supermarket. This ambitious project required copper to make the pins of the electrical plug, the cord, and internal wires, iron to make the steel grilling apparatus, and the spring to pop up the toast, nickel to make the heating element, mica, a mineral a bit like slate, around which the heating element is wound, and of course plastic for the plug and cord insulation, and for the all-important, sleek-looking casing. After 9 months, and at a cost of over £1,000, Thomas finally managed to create a sort of toaster. It lasted 5 seconds, the heating element bursting into flames. However, along his journey, Thomas had been forced to resort to using all sorts of other complex devices built from similar standard components that he could have used to make his toaster. Everything from microwaves to leaf blowers was involved in achieving his goal. Our society and the wondrous technologies that we can create not only consume but are dependent upon provision of these standard components. Remove this, and the wheel of progress grinds very slowly and very expensively. Back in 2004, Thomas hadn't attempted this experiment, but I was acutely aware that we lived in a world where there's a constant flow of change, where the novel becomes commonplace, and where the commonplace enables the novel. This is the environment that businesses live within. This entire process is driven by competition. The desire to differentiate creates the novel. The desire to keep up with others makes it commonplace. If we define economic progress as the movement of our society to ever more complex technological marvels, then progress is simply a manifestation of this competition. This impacts all organizations. This is what we have to map. But in all this complexity, there was also comfort. I knew my world was built of components, and hence it had its own chess pieces. Those pieces changed, but there might be a way of describing evolution and the movement from novel to commonplace. But movement is not enough for a map. I also needed to find the position of these components, and that required some form of anchor. Alas, I had no anchor, and without it, then I was still lost. In later chapters, I'm going to dive into the details of how this first map was created, how I discovered that anchor, and ultimately describe the movement of evolution. However, for our purposes, I'm going to simply show you a map, explain what bits matter, and then use it to navigate the strategy cycle. I would dearly love to claim that this map was the result of some towering intellectual might, but in reality, as you will later discover, it was more trial and error combined with endless accidents. Figure 8 is what a map of a single line of business should look like. I created my first map in 2005, and it was for an online photo service that I ran. Take a few minutes to read it carefully. So we've got a Wardley map template labeled value chain along the y-axis along the left, with visible at the top and invisible at the bottom, and then an x-axis from left to right, with 4 stages of evolution from genesis to custom built to product and rental to commodity and utility. And then within the bounds of these 2 axes, at the very top we have the customer and lines coming out of the customer towards different components, such as online image manipulation, online photo storage, print, and website. And these have relationships between them that represent dependency. So customer needs online image manipulation, and then online image manipulation needs online photo storage, and online photo storage needs website. And this continues all the way down to power. The map is visual and context specific, in that it is unique to that line of business containing the components that influence it at the moment in time. This is not a map of an automotive industry in 2016 or a pharmaceutical company in 2010, but instead an online photo service in 2005. The map has an anchor, which is the user, in this case a public customer, though other types of user exist, and their needs. The position of components in the map are shown relative to that user on a value chain, represented by the y-axis. Each component needs the component below it. However, the higher up the map a component is, then the more visible it becomes to the user. The lower it is, then the less visible it becomes. For example, in that first map, the user cares about online photo storage, but whilst this needs the provision of underlying components such as compute and power, those components are positioned far from the user and hence are less visible. I could have described this as a chain of needs, but I wanted to emphasize what the user valued. They cared about what was provided to them and not who provided my electricity. Of course, as the provider of the service, I cared about everything: my users' needs, what compute we used, and even what electricity provider we employed. In much the same way, the user cares about the toaster and what it does, and not that you lovingly created nickel heating elements by hand rather than using standard components. Though they will probably care if you try and charge them £1,000 for a toaster which bursts into flames at first use. The components of the map also have a stage of evolution. These are Genesis. This represents the unique, the very rare, the uncertain, the constantly changing, and the newly discovered. Our focus is on exploration. Custom built. This represents the very uncommon and that which we are still learning about. It is individually made and tailored for a specific environment. It is bespoke. It frequently changes. It is an artisan skill. You wouldn't expect to see 2 of these that are the same. Our focus is on learning and our craft. Product, including rental. This represents the increasingly common, the manufactured through a repeatable process, the more defined, the better understood. Change becomes slower here. Whilst there exists differentiation, particularly in the early stages, there is increasing stability and sameness. You will often see many of the same product. Our focus is on refining and improving. Commodity, including utility. This represents scale and volume operations of production, the highly standardized, the defined, the fixed, the undifferentiated, the fit for a specific known purpose and repetition, and more repetition. Our focus is on ruthless removal of deviation, on industrialization, and operational efficiency. With time, we become habituated to the act. It is increasingly less visible, and we often forget it's even there. This evolution is shown as the x-axis, and all the components on the map are moving from left to right, driven by supply and demand competition. In other words, the map is not static, but fluid, and as components evolve, they become more commodity-like. In Figure 9, I've taken the original map above and explicitly highlighted the elements that matter. This map has all the basic elements of any map: visual, context-specific, position of components based upon an anchor, and movement. In later chapters, as appropriate, we will explore each in more detail. So again, Simon has that same map of that business line with the customer at the top, and the customer is circled and labeled anchor with user needs in the parentheses. He also has the y-axis of the value chain labeled as position relative to that anchor. And then he has the x-axis labeled movement with evolution in parentheses. However, the map also has some advanced features which are not so immediately obvious. There is a flow of risk, information, and money between components. The best way to think of this is by use of a military example. You have components such as troops, which might occupy different positions on the map, but along with movement, you also have communication between the troops. That communication is flow. It's important not to mix those ideas together because it's easy to have troops effectively communicating together, but at the same time being ineffective by moving in the wrong direction. There can be several reasons for this, including the wrong orders are given or there is no common understanding of purpose. The components can also represent different types of things, the military equivalent of different troops: infantry, tanks, and artillery. In these Wardley maps, the common name now given to them due to my inability to find something useful to call them, then, these types represent activities, practices, data, and knowledge. All of these types of components can move, and in our case, this means evolve from left to right, driven by competition. However, the terms we use to describe the separate stages of evolution are different for each type. In order to keep the map simple, the x-axis of evolution shows the terms for activities alone. The terms that I use today for other types of things are provided in Figure 10. So we have a table with stages of evolution along the top, stages 1, 2, 3, and 4. And underneath those stages, we have different types of capabilities. We have activities, practices, data, and knowledge. And then we have different labels for each of those types of capabilities. For example, activities, in stage 1 we call them Genesis, in stage 2, Custom, in stage 3, Product and Rental Services, in stage 4, Commodity and Utility Services. Practices are different. Practices in stage 1 we call Novel, in stage 2, Emerging, 3, Good, 4, Best. And then data. Data is a different component type. In stage 1 we call it Unmodeled, in stage 2, Divergent, in stage 3, Convergent, in stage 4, Modeled. And then knowledge. In stage 1 we call knowledge Concept, stage 2, Hypothesis, stage 3, Theory, and stage 4, Accepted. Lastly, climatic patterns can be shown on the map. I've highlighted these more advanced elements onto Figure 11. So again, we have Simon's diagram of his line of business with flows highlighted through the value chain from top to bottom, as well as different types of components and labeling climate patterns such as inertia. In the above map, platform is considered to be evolving to a more utility form, and inertia exists to the change. Normally, we don't mark up all of these basic and advanced elements in this way. We simply accept that they are there. However, it's worth knowing that they exist. The normal way to represent the above map is provided in figure 12. And so this is the same map with a more simple notation highlighting a point of change, which is the platform, and an inertial barrier between product and commodity stages for that platform. Now, with a simple map, such as figure 12, we can start to discuss the landscape. For example, have we represented the user need reasonably, and are we taking steps to meet that user need? Maybe we're missing something, such as an unmet need that we haven't included. Are we treating components in the right way? Are we using a utility for power, or are we somehow building our own power station as though it's a core differentiator visible to the user? If so, why? Have we included all the relevant components on the map, or are we missing key critical items? We can also start to discuss our anticipations of change. What happens when platform becomes more of a utility? How does this affect us? What sort of inertia will we face? Maps are fundamentally a communication and learning tool. In the next chapter, we're going to loop through the strategy cycle in order for me to teach you some of the basic lessons that I learned. However, before we do this, I just want to describe a few steps to help you create your own maps. Step 1, needs. Critical to mapping is the anchor, and hence you must first focus on the user need. This requires you to define the scope of what you're looking at. Are we a tea shop, an automotive company, a nation state, or a specific system? The trick is to start somewhere. You will often find that in the process of mapping you need to expand or reduce your scope, and there's nothing wrong with this. A map for a particular company is part of a wider map for the ecosystem that the company operates within. A map of a particular system within a company is part of the map for the entire company. You can expand and reduce as necessary. It's worth noting that the user needs of one map are components in another. For example, the user needs for a company producing nuts and bolts become the components used, in other words, nuts and bolts, for a company producing automobiles or bridges. In our first map, the user needs for an electricity provider are simply drawn as a single component far down the value chain of our map and described as power. As a user, we could describe our needs for power as being reliable, utility-like, provided in standard forms and accessible. From the perspective of examining an online photo service, then a single component is enough. However, that single component will break into an entire map for an electricity provider, including different forms of transmission, generation, and even spot markets. A single node on one map can be an entire map from another person's perspective. Equally, the entire map of your business might be a single component for someone else. Hence, start with a scope and define the user needs for that scope. Be careful, though, because a common trap is not to think of your user's needs, but instead to start to describe your own needs, such as your desire to make a profit, to sell a product, or be successful. Yes, your business is a user with its own needs, but this is different from, say, your public customers. To keep things simple for now, focus on them. You need to think precisely about what your user needs. If you're a tea shop, then your users may have needs such as a refreshing drink, a convenient location, a comfortable environment, a quick service, and a tasty treat like a piece of lemon drizzle cake. This in turn requires you to have the capability to satisfy those needs. If you don't, then your plan for world domination of the tea industry might be abruptly halted. At the same time, you should distinguish between the many things that your users want, but do not necessarily need. So start with the questions such as, what does this thing need to do? How will its consumers interact with it? And what do they expect from it? There are various techniques to help elucidate this, but I found nothing more effective than talking directly to your own users. Creating a user journey for how they interact with what you provide is always a good start. As you discuss with users, along with the usual list of wants, like, I want my cup of tea to make me fabulously witty, slim, and handsome, then you might find they have genuine unmet needs or novel needs that they find difficult in describing. These are important. Don't ignore them just because you don't provide them at the time. Back in 2005, our user needs for the online photo service included such things as sharing photos online with other users. This required us to have a capability such as the storage of digital photos and a website to upload them and share them with others. These capabilities are your highest level components and the manifestation of your user needs. For us, that included the storage of digital photos, manipulation of images, removal of red dye, cropping, sharing of images via the website, and printing to physical products from photos to mouse mounts. This is shown in Figure 13. So Figure 13 just highlights the customer and then the direct needs underneath: online image manipulation, online photo storage, website, and print. Step 2, value chain. Whilst having user needs is a great start, just knowing the needs doesn't mean the stuff will now build itself. There are other things involved, and this is what we call a value chain. It can be simply determined by first asking the question of what is the user need, and then by asking further questions of what components do we need in order to build this capability. For example, in the case of our online photo service, once the basic user needs were known, then we could describe our top-level capabilities, our top-level components. We could then describe the subcomponents that these visible components in themselves would need. The best way I've found of doing this from practice is to gather a group of people familiar with the business and huddle them in some room with lots of post-it notes and a huge whiteboard. On the post-it notes, write down the user needs and the top-level capabilities required to meet them. Place these on the wall in a fairly random order. Then, for each capability, using more post-it notes, the group should start to write down any subcomponents that these top-level components will use. This can include any activity, data, practice, or set of knowledge. For each subcomponent, further subcomponents should then be identified until a point is reached that the subcomponents are now outside of the scope of what you're mapping. Power doesn't need to be broken down any further if the company consumes it from a utility provider. By way of example, to manipulate online digital photos needs some sort of online digital photo storage component. This in turn needs a website, which in turn needs a platform, that in turn needs compute resources, storage resources, an operating system, network, power, and so forth. These components will become part of your value chain, and any component should only be written once. When the group is satisfied that a reasonable set of components for all the needs have been written, then draw a single vertical line and mark it as the value chain, as shown in Figure 14. So in Figure 14, we have that same image of the customer and the direct customer high-level capabilities, so online image manipulation, online photo storage, website, and print. And then underneath those things, we have subcomponents: CRM, data center, platform, power, and compute. And then along the left-hand side, there's a single line labeled value chain, with visible at the top and invisible at the bottom. The top-level components, in other words, your capabilities, what you produce, what is most visible to the user, should be placed near the top of the value chain. Subcomponents should be placed underneath with lines drawn between components to show how they are related. In other words, this component needs that component. As you go through this process, you may wish to add or discard components depending upon how relevant you feel they are to drawing a useful picture of the landscape. They can always be added or removed later. In Figure 15, I've provided a value chain for our online photo service, adding in the superfluous term needs to emphasize that this is a chain of needs. Obviously, for simplicity, not everything is included, for example, payments. Before you ask, most users do have a need for not being accused of theft, so providing a payment capability is quite useful to both them and your business, assuming that you're not giving everything away freely. So here's Figure 15. It's a value chain. It's pretty similar to Figure 14, except now we have relationships drawn between all of the components. And next to each of these relationships, we have the word needs. So this is emphasizing the relationship of dependency from top to bottom. So for example, Customer needs website. Website needs platform. Platform needs compute. Compute needs power. To reiterate, things near the top are more visible and have more value to the user. For example, online image manipulation was placed slightly higher than online photo storage because it was seen as a differentiator with other services that existed in 2005 and hence valued by users. Online photo storage was also a subcomponent of image manipulation and was placed lower. The website, a necessity for sharing, was placed slightly further down because, though it was essential, many websites existed and it was also a subcomponent of online photo storage. Now, this last point we could easily argue over, but the purpose of doing this in a group is you'll often get challenges and debates over what components exist and how important they are. This is exactly what you want to happen, in the same way a military commander welcomes challenge on the ground from troops on the position of forces and key features. Don't ignore the challenge, but celebrate it, as this will become key to making a better map. But also, don't waste time trying to make a perfect value chain in order to build a perfect map. It's not only impossible, it's unnecessary. All maps, including geographical maps, are imperfect representations of what exists. To draw a perfect geographical map, then, you would have to use a 1-to-1 scale, at which point the map being the size of the landscape it covers is anything but useful. A map of France, the size of France, helps no one. Step 3. Map. As I quickly discovered, value chains on their own are reasonably useless for understanding strategic play in an environment. This is because they lack any form of context on how it is changing. In other words, there's a lack of movement. If you think back to the example of Nokia, then its value chains have radically altered over time from a paper mill to telecommunications company. In order to understand the environment, we therefore need to capture this aspect of change and combine it with our value chain. The largest problem with creating an understanding of the context in which something operates is that this process of change and how things evolve cannot be measured over time. As uncomfortable as it is, you have to simply accept that you don't have a crystal ball, and hence you have to embrace the uncertainty of future change. Fortunately, there's a neat trick because whilst evolution cannot be measured over time, the different stages of evolution can be described. So, this is exactly what you need to do. Take your value chain and turn it into a map with an evolution axis. On the wall or in whatever tool you've used to create your value chain, now add a horizontal line for evolution. Mark on sections for Genesis, custom built, product, and commodity, as shown in figure 16. Okay, so we've got figure 16, and it's the exact same as figure 15, just the value chain, right? And then what we've done is we've added this x-axis with 4 sections labeled Genesis, custom built, product and rental, commodity and utility. And this x-axis is evolution. Unless you're extremely lucky, then all the components are likely to be in the wrong stages of evolution. Hence, start to move the components of the value chain to their relevant stage. For each component, the group should question how evolved it is. In practice, the best way to do this is to examine its characteristics and ask, how ubiquitous and well-defined is the component? Do all my competitors use such a component? Is the component available as a product or a utility service? Is this something new? Be warned, this step is often the main cause of arguments in the group. You will regularly come across components that parts of the group feel passionate about. They will declare it as unique, despite the fact that all your competitors have it. There is also the danger that you will describe the component by how you treat it, rather than how it should be treated. Even today, in 2016, there are companies that custom build their own CRM, customer relationship management system, despite its near ubiquity and essential use in most industries. There are many causes for this, some of which are due to inertia and the component being a pet project, and in other cases, it is because the component is actually multiple subcomponents. In the latter case, you'll often find that most of the subcomponents are commodity, with maybe 1 or 2 that are genuinely novel. Break it down into those subcomponents. It is essential for you to challenge the assumptions, and that is part of what mapping is all about. Exposing the assumptions we make and providing a means to challenge. This is also why working in a group matters, because it's far too easy for an individual to apply their own biases to a map. If we think of mapping a tea shop, then we might argue that our lemon drizzle cake is homemade and therefore custom built. But in reality, is the provision of a cake in a tea shop something that is rare and hence relatively novel? Or is the reality that a user expects a tea shop to provide cake and it is commonplace? You might market the cake as homemade, but don't confuse what you market something as what it actually is. The tea shop up the road could just as easily buy a mass-produced cake, add some finishing flourishes to it, and describe it as homemade. If it's cheaper, just as tasty, more consistent, and to the user an expected norm for a tea shop, then you'll be at a disadvantage. The same is true of building your own Thomas Thwaites toaster, rather than buying a commodity version to provide toast. To help you in the process of challenge, I've added a cheat sheet in Figure 17 for the characteristics of activities. How this was created will be discussed in later chapters, but for now, simply use this as a guide. Where arguments continue to rage, then look to see if the component is in fact multiple subcomponents. Okay, this cheat sheet is a big one, so I'm going to go through it with you here. Across the top, we have the stage of activity, Genesis, custom, product, and commodity. And then we have some characteristics and how each of those characteristics occur or are described in each of these stages of evolution. So for example, the ubiquity characteristic in Genesis is rare. In custom, it's slowly increasing consumption. In product, it's rapidly increasing consumption. And in commodity, it's widespread and stabilizing. Meanwhile, the certainty characteristic starts out poorly understood, becomes rapid increases in learning, and then becomes rapid increases in use / fit for purpose, and then becomes commonly understood in terms of use. And then the last characteristic is publication types. It starts out in Genesis as normally describe the wonder of the thing, then in custom becomes build / construct / awareness and learning, and then becomes in product maintenance / operations / installation / feature. And then in commodity, it becomes focused on use. So besides characteristics, we also have a list of general properties. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. So market starts out undefined, becomes forming, then becomes growing, then becomes mature. Knowledge management starts out uncertain, then becomes learning on use, and then learning on operation, and then known / accepted. Market perception starts out chaotic, nonlinear, and then becomes domain of experts, increasing expectations of use next, and then ordered, the appearance of being linear / trivial. User perception starts out in Genesis as different, confusing, exciting, surprising, becomes leading edge and emerging, and then becomes common, disappointed if not used or available, and then becomes standard and expected. The next property is perception in industry. It starts out as competitive advantage, unpredictable, unknown, then becomes competitive advantage, ROI, case examples, and then becomes advantage through implementation / features, and then becomes cost of doing business / accepted. Focus of value is the next property. It starts out as high future worth in Genesis, becomes seeking profit / ROI ? In custom, becomes high profitability in product, and then becomes high volume / reducing margin in commodity. The next property is understanding, which starts out poorly understood / unpredictable, becomes increasing understanding / development of measures, and then becomes increasing education / constant refinement of needs / measures, and then becomes believed to be well-defined, stable, measurable. Next one is comparison. Comparison starts out constantly changing, a differential, unstable, then becomes learning from others, testing the water, some evidential support, then becomes about feature difference, and then finally becomes essential / operational advantage. The next property is failure. Failure starts out in Genesis as high, tolerated, and assumed, becomes moderate, unsurprising, but disappointed in custom, and then becomes not tolerated, focus on constant improvement in product, and then becomes operational efficiency and surprised by failure in commodity. The next general property is market action. Starts out in Genesis as gambling / driven by gut, becomes exploring a found value, then becomes market analysis / listening to customers, and then becomes metric-driven, build what is needed. The second to last property is efficiency. Starts out in Genesis as reducing the cost of change, as in experimentation, then becomes reducing the cost of waste, as in learning. It continues to be about reducing the cost of waste and learning in the third stage in product. And then in commodity, it becomes reducing cost of deviation, and it's about volume. The last property is decision drivers. Starts out in Genesis as heritage and culture, becomes analysis and synthesis for custom, remains analysis and synthesis for product, and then in commodity, it's about previous experience. So that's the evolutionary characteristics cheat sheet in Figure 17. Don't worry if some of the terms are confusing in the cheat sheet. Just use what you can. Like chess, mapping is a craft, and you will get better with practice. Today, topographical intelligence in business is more about Babylonian clay tablet than ordinary survey maps for industries. The art is very much in the custom-built stage of evolution. You can see the cheat sheet above. You should aim to complete an entire map of a line of business in a matter of hours, though there is nothing wrong with spending longer in your first attempts in order to get used to the process. I'm afraid there is a big downside here. Mapping, like learning to play chess, is something that only you and your team can do. You will have to follow the path that I took when I was a CEO and learn to map. You can't outsource mapping to someone else any more than you can outsource learning to play chess to a consultancy. Well, technically you can, but you won't be learning, and you'll just become dependent upon them, constantly asking for your next move. Which, to be honest, is what many of us have done. But then if you're happy with that, stop reading this book and just ask a consultancy for your strategy. If you're not happy with that, then be warned that the amount of value that you will get from mapping increases with the amount of work you put into repeatedly using it. It's also worth noting that when adding practices, data, and knowledge to your map, then you can use the same cheat sheet for each stage of evolution. That is, data that is modeled, see Figure 10, should be widespread, commonly understood, essential, and believed to be well-defined. It shares the same characteristics as commodity activities. Once you have placed the components in their relevant stage to the best of your ability, you now have a map as per Figure 18. Remember that this map was for an online photo service in 2005, and so the composition of components and their position will not be the same as they are today. We expect an awful lot more from an online photo service in 2016. The map is hence fluid and constantly evolving. So in Figure 18, we have the same diagram with our value chain and our evolution axis, but this time each of the components of that value chain are positioned according to where Simon thought they were back in the early 2000s. So he has them positioned from left to right in Genesis, custom built, product, or commodity. So for example, power he has positioned in commodity, whereas online image manipulation he has positioned in custom built. The next thing to do is to share your maps with others in your organization and allow them to challenge you and ideally your group. This is exactly what I did with my colleague James Duncan, who was CIO of the company at the time. With help from James, I refined both the map and the concept, something which I owe him a great deal of thanks for. If there is a co-inventor of mapping, then it would be James. Our robust debates in the boardroom showed me that business and IT are not separate, but we could discuss strategic gameplay together around a map. It's a bit like the Army and the Air Force. They might have different capabilities and strengths, but if we use a map to communicate, then we can make all of this work together. I have found subsequently, this process of sharing not only refines the map, but spreads ownership of it. You should also use this time to consider any unmet needs, any missing components, and ask questions on whether you're treating things in the right way. It's often surprising to find how many companies are spending vast resources on building their own metaphorical Thomas Thwaites toasters when a commodity version is readily available. With a map in hand, we're now ready to start exploring the strategy cycle and hopefully start learning some useful lessons. Well, at least that's what I hoped for in 2005. In the next chapter, I intend to show you what I discover. But before I do, I have a request to make of you. Take a break, read or listen to this chapter again, pick a part of your business and have a go at mapping at it. Simply follow the steps and use the cheat sheet. Ideally, grab a couple of other people that are deeply familiar with that business to help you, and don't spend too long on it. Keep it to a couple of hours, 3 to 4 at most. If within that time you don't feel you're learning more about that business, and the mapping isn't raising questions on user needs and what's involved, then stop. You can recover your lost time by simply not reading any more chapters. Pick this book up, aim for the refuse bin, and with a shout of, "That was a complete waste," then let it fly. If instead you found the exercise interesting, then let us continue this journey together. Thank you for being here and listening to part 2 of this Wardley mapping book by Simon Wardley. If you'd like to read the book for yourself and get ahead of the audio here, you can go to learnwardleymapping.com/book. The other thing I'll say is if you want to practice making your map for the very first time, go to learnwardleymapping.com. There's a lovely button there that says try it now, and you'll be taken to a video that walks you through a 10-minute process of how to make your first map. I think you can get through it in just a couple minutes, maybe half an hour, but you can spend a long time thinking about all the sorts of amazing things that new questions you'll be able to ask, new opportunities you'll notice that making a map can get you. And if you'd like to join our upcoming events, we have live streams with guests making maps. We also have workshops and practice sessions coming up. If you'd like to join us for those, come to lwm.events right here and find us and join an upcoming event. I hope to see you soon, and until then, thanks for watching.